The bread was the only thing in the house that always turned out right. Everything else in Maren Ashby's life that autumn had a crack running through it somewhere. The boiler that clanged like a dropped pan every morning at 6. The back door that had to be lifted on its hinge to close. The letters from the bank that she'd stopped opening and started stacking, spine out, on the shelf above the kettle where she wouldn't have to read the red print. But the bread came out right. It came out right when nothing else would. And on the mornings when she wasn't sure how she was going to get through the day, that was sometimes the thing she held on to. She'd started baking it for Toby, really. That was the honest beginning of it before it became anything else. He was 7 then, small for his age, with a cough that came back every winter and a way of going quiet at the dinner table that a mother notices before she can name it. The shop bread they could afford was the pale sliced kind that came in plastic and went a paste in your mouth, and Toby ate it because there was nothing else. And one night Maren watched him pick the crust off and leave it at the edge of his plate, not complaining, just leaving it, and something in her chest turned over. Her Nan had baked. That was the thread she pulled. Somewhere in the back of the airing cupboard, wrapped in a tea towel gone stiff with age, was a stoneware bowl her Nan had used, and a recipe that wasn't written down anywhere because her Nan had never trusted paper with anything that mattered. Maren had watched her make it 100 times as a girl in a kitchen in Stockport that smelled of yeast and coal smoke, and she found, when she tried, that her hands remembered more than her head did. The weight of the flour, the way you knew the dough was ready not by a clock but by how it pushed back against your knuckles, alive under your hands. The first loaf was dense as a brick and she nearly cried over it. The fourth was passable. By the 10th she'd stopped measuring, and Toby ate 2 thick slices with butter and honey and asked, with his mouth full, if she could make it again tomorrow. So she did, and the day after. And it became the shape of their mornings, the smell of it filling the small terraced house on Prospect Row before the sun was properly up, Toby patting down in his socks to sit on the stool by the counter and watch the oven like it was television. For a while that was all it was. A mother, a boy, a loaf of bread. If you told her then that this same recipe would one day sit in a boardroom in a glass tower with lawyers arguing over what it was worth, she'd have laughed at you and gone back to her kneading. But that comes later. First there was the winter, and the winter was hard. Toby's father had gone 18 months before, and Maren had trained herself not to say his name even in her own head, because his name came with a whole freight of things she couldn't carry and still stand up. Ray, there. She could think it now most days without the flinch. He hadn't died. It would almost have been easier if he'd died, and she was ashamed of the thought, but she'd had it. He'd simply decided, somewhere in the long gray stretch of Toby's 5th year, that the life they'd built was not the life he wanted, and he'd gone to find another one in Leeds with a woman called Dominique who did something with property. The maintenance came sometimes. More often it didn't. Maren had stopped budgeting around the possibility of it, which was its own small freedom, the freedom of expecting nothing. She cleaned houses. 3 years she'd been doing it, for an agency that took 40% and sent her to addresses in the good part of town where the kitchens were the size of her whole ground floor, and the fridges were full of food that went off before anyone ate it. She was good at it, thorough, and the clients liked her because she didn't chatter and she didn't judge and she left rooms better than she found them. It paid, barely. It did not pay enough, but it paid, and there is a kind of person who can hold a life together on barely for years through sheer refusal to let it fall, and Maren was that kind of person, though it had cost her more than anyone knew. The bread started paying its way almost by accident. There was a woman on Prospect Row, Sylvie, 3 doors down, who'd smelled the baking one Saturday when Maren had the kitchen window cracked, and had knocked and asked, half joking, whether she could buy a loaf. Maren had given her one for nothing, embarrassed, and Sylvie had come back 2 days later and pressed 3 pounds into her hand and said, in the flat, brooking no-argument way of a woman who'd raised 4 children, "You'll take it, love, because if you don't I can't ask again, and I want to ask again." 3 pounds, it didn't sound like anything. But Sylvie told her sister, and the sister told a friend. And by the spring there were 6 or 7 regulars, and then more. And Maren found herself baking 12 loaves on a Saturday morning, and selling every one before noon, cash in an old biscuit tin. And she started to understand that the thing she'd been doing for love might also be a thing that kept the lights on. She gave it a name eventually, though she was shy about it. She wrote Ashby's on brown paper labels in her careful hand and tied them round the loaves with string, and when Toby asked why she'd put their name on it, she said, without quite knowing where the words came from, "Because it's ours. Nobody can take a thing that's got your own name on it." She was wrong about that, as it turned out. But she didn't know it yet, and there's a mercy in not knowing. The market was Denby's idea. Denby ran the hardware stall at the Saturday market in the old covered hall by the canal, and he was one of Sylvie's converts, a great slab of a man with hands like gardening gloves who bought 2 loaves every week and ate one of them before he got home, or so he claimed. He'd been watching Maren hand loaves to people at her front door for months, watching the queue, and one wet Saturday he leaned on her gatepost with his collar up against the rain and said what he'd been thinking. "You're doing it wrong, you know." "Thanks very much." "Not the bread. The bread's the best I've had since my mother, God rest her. I mean you're doing the selling wrong. Standing here at your door like a milk float. You want a stall. There's a spot going at the hall corner one by the fish. Fella packed it in. I could have a word." Maren had every reason to say no. The stall was money she didn't have up front for a pitch, and it meant baking at a scale she wasn't sure she could manage in a domestic oven, and it meant standing behind a table all day being looked at, which some deep and wounded part of her flinched from. She'd got used to being invisible. There was a safety in it. The woman who cleaned your house and the woman behind the bread stall were different women, and the second one could be seen, could fail, could be judged. She said no. Then she went home and lay awake and did the sums, the real sums, the ones about how many more winters she could do this, and about Toby's shoes that were letting in water, and about the red letters on the shelf. And in the morning she rang Denby and said yes before she could talk herself out of it again. The first market day she made 30 loaves and sold 9. She stood behind that table for 6 hours in the cold of the hall, and she watched people walk past her with their eyes sliding away the way people's eyes slide away from something they haven't decided about yet. And by 2 o'clock she had 21 loaves left, and a feeling in her stomach like the floor of a lift dropping. Denby came over on his break and looked at the pile and didn't say anything stupid, which she was grateful for. He just picked up a loaf, tore the end off, ate it, and said loudly enough for the fish man to hear, "Best bread in the hall, this. I'm not being funny, it's not even close." She sold 4 more that afternoon. She took the rest home, and she and Toby ate bread for 3 days, and she told herself it was a lesson, an expensive one, and that she'd learned it. But she went back the next Saturday. That was the thing about Maren that even she didn't fully understand about herself. She went back. She had gone back to the kneading when the first loaf came out like a brick, and she'd gone back to the market when the first day near broke her, and this going back was the engine of everything that happened to her afterward, though it looked like nothing from the outside. It looked like a tired woman setting up a folding table. It was the most stubborn kind of hope there is. The second Saturday she sold 19. The third, 28, and had to turn people away, and a woman she'd never met asked if she took orders because her daughter was getting married and wanted proper bread, not the muck from the supermarket. And Maren wrote the order down in a notebook with her hand not quite steady, and that was the first wedding. By midsummer she had a waiting list. She should have been happy. She was, in the exhausted way of someone whose happiness is always half spoken for by worry. But the thing about a business that grows out of a home kitchen is that it grows past the kitchen, and the summer that Ashby's took off was the summer the oven finally gave up. It went on a Thursday night, the old cooker, with a smell of burning and a bang that brought Toby to the top of the stairs in his pajamas, and Maren stood in the kitchen looking at the dead thing and felt the whole fragile structure of the last 2 years sway. No oven, no bread. No bread, no market. No market, and she was back to being only the woman who cleaned houses, with a waiting list of people she'd have to let down and a wedding order for the Saturday after next. She didn't have the money for a new one. She had, in the biscuit tin and the bank between them, about a third of what even a cheap replacement cost. She sat at the kitchen table long after Toby had gone back to sleep, and she let herself, for once, feel the full weight of it, the sheer relentless mathematics of a life where there was never quite enough and never would be, and where every time you got your head an inch above the water something reached up and pulled you back down. It was Sylvie who found the answer, or the start of one. Because Maren, in a low moment she was later half ashamed of, had told Sylvie about the oven, and Sylvie had a nephew, and the nephew knew a man who was clearing out a cafe that had gone under on the high street, and in the back of that cafe was a proper baker's oven, a great steel commercial thing, going for scrap price because the man wanted it gone before the lease ran out. £300. Maren had 210. She sold her Nan's ring for the difference. It wasn't worth much 9-carat gold, a little sapphire chip, the kind of ring that had been someone's whole savings once, and was now the kind of thing a jeweler weighs on a scale and offers you 90 quid for without looking up. Maren had kept it through everything. Through Ray, through the lean years, through nights when she'd stood in the pawn shop doorway and turned around and walked home again because some things you don't sell. But she sold it for the oven, and she told herself her Nan would have understood. Her Nan who'd never trusted paper but who'd have understood a woman doing what needed doing to feed her boy. Toby helped her scrub the oven clean in the yard, the two of them going at 40 years of grease with wire wool and fairy liquid, and when they finally fired it up and the first batch came out, and it was better, the even heat of the big steel box doing things her domestic oven never could, Toby did a lap of the yard with his arms out like an aeroplane, and Maren laughed until she had to sit down on the back step, and it was, she thought later, one of the happiest afternoons of her whole life. She didn't have a pound to spare and she just sold her Nan's ring, and the future was as uncertain as it had ever been. But the bread came out right, and her boy was laughing, and sometimes that's the whole of what you get, and it's enough. He almost missed the whole thing in the end, because he nearly didn't take the meeting. Callum Reeve had been at Brentwood Mills for 6 years by the autumn it happened, and he had reached the particular stage of a corporate career where a man starts to suspect that the thing he is good at is not the thing he set out to do. He was head of acquisitions, which meant he flew around the country in economy and sat in rooms and decided which small food businesses were worth the parent company swallowing. Brentwood was the biggest bakery chain in the north. You'd know the logo, the little wheat sheaf. It was on the packaging of half the sliced bread in every supermarket from Carlisle to Coventry. And Callum's job was to find the small, hungry, characterful businesses that were doing something Brentwood couldn't do with its industrial lines, and to bring them in-house before a competitor did. Mostly it was numbers. He'd stopped tasting things years ago in any real sense. He read spreadsheets the way other men read faces. But every so often his boss, a smooth and dangerous man named Preston Vale, would send him after something for reasons that weren't on the spreadsheet, and the Ashby's file was one of those. "There's a market baker," Preston had said, sliding a thin folder across the table in that way he had, like he was doing you a favor by giving you work. "Up your way. Little operation, one woman, but she's got something, wedding contracts, a waiting list 200 deep, and there's a story to her, single mum, sold her jewelry to buy the oven, all that. The marketing people are practically weeping. Go and see if she'll sell. Offer whatever it takes to get her in the room." Callum had read the file on the train and felt the old machinery of his job engage, and underneath it, faintly, something he didn't have a name for yet. Because the numbers on the Ashby's operation didn't make sense. A one-woman market stall does not generate the kind of loyalty the file described. People did not drive 40 minutes for bread. People did not put a market baker's loaves on the front of local wedding photographs and tag her on the internet and write. In the reviews the marketing team had printed out things like the best thing I have ever eaten and tastes like my grandmother's, and I don't know how she does it. Something was in that bread that wasn't in the spreadsheet. And Callum Reeve, who had forgotten how to taste things, found that he wanted to know what it was. 10 years had made Maren Ashby into a different woman on the outside, and much the same one underneath. The stall had become 2 stalls, then a unit at the market, then a small shopfront on the high street 2 doors down from the cafe whose oven had saved her. She'd bought the freehold 3 years back, a thing that still didn't feel real when she turned the key in the morning. Ashby's it said over the door, in the same hand she'd written on those first brown paper labels, blown up and painted by a signwriter who'd refused to charge her the full rate because his mother swore by the sourdough. She had 4 people working for her now. She had a delivery van with the wheat sheaf. No, not the wheat sheaf that came later, that was theirs, with a little painted loaf on the side in Toby's design. Because Toby was 17 now and did the artwork and the social media, and towered over her by half a foot and still, on Saturday mornings, sat on a stool in the bakery and watched the ovens like they were television. She still baked the same bread. That was the thing she'd held to through all of it, through every consultant and well-meaning friend who told her to expand the range, cut the labor, buy in the dough. She made it the way her nan had made it, by hand, by feel, the recipe still living nowhere but in her own 2 hands, and now, because she wasn't a fool, and because she'd nearly lost it once when she'd had pneumonia the winter of the 2nd year and lain in bed terrified that if she died it would die with her, in Toby's hands too. She'd taught him over one long summer. It was the only copy that existed. It was worth, though she didn't think of it in these terms, a very great deal of money, precisely because it had never been written down, never been standardized, never been made anywhere but in a small bakery on a high street by 2 people who loved each other. She was doing all right. Not rich, nobody got rich selling bread by hand, but all right, which after the years she'd had was a country she was still learning the language of. The red letters were long gone. Toby had good shoes and better prospects. He wanted to study design, and she could pay for it now, or nearly, and the nearly didn't frighten her the way it once had. So when the man from Brentwood rang and asked, very courteously, whether he might come and talk to her about an opportunity, her first instinct was to say no. She'd had approaches before, smaller ones, and she'd learned to smell them. But this one was polite, and it was a wet week, and something in the man's voice, a tiredness under the smoothness, a person rather than a script, made her say, against her better judgment, that he could come on Thursday after closing, and that she'd put the kettle on but that she wasn't promising anything. "I wouldn't expect you to," said Callum Reeve, and hung up, and sat looking at his phone for a while longer than the call warranted. He wasn't what she expected. She'd expected a suit, and he was wearing one, but it was the kind of suit a man wears because he has to rather than because he loves it, slightly rumpled at the end of a long day, and he'd taken his tie off in the car and forgotten to put it back on. He was younger than she'd thought, mid-40s maybe, with gray coming in at the temples and the particular gray pallor of a man who ate at motorway services and slept in hotels. He shook her flour-dusted hand without hesitating over the flour, and he looked around the little shop. She'd kept him back till after closing, the shutters half down, just the 2 of them and the last of the day's warmth still coming off the ovens, with an attention that seemed real. "It smells incredible in here," he said, and it wasn't a line. She could tell it wasn't a line because he said it almost to himself. "It's just bread." She said it to see what he'd do. "No," he said. "It isn't." And he looked at her, and something passed between them that neither of them would have been able to name, a recognition, 2 tired people who'd each been carrying something heavy for a long time, meeting across a counter. She gave him the end of a loaf, the way Denby had done for her 100 years ago, and she watched him eat it, and she watched something happen in his face that she'd seen happen in other faces, but never in a man in a suit sent by a company. He stopped. He actually stopped mid-chew and closed his eyes for a second, and when he opened them they were bright in a way he seemed embarrassed by. "My gran," he said, I haven't tasted anything like that since I was a boy." He put the crust down carefully like it might break. "I'm supposed to be very good at this, Mrs. Ashby. My job. I'm supposed to come in here and be very clever and get you to sign something. And I'm sitting here about to make a complete mess of it because that's the best thing I've eaten in 20 years, and I've forgotten every clever thing I meant to say." Maren laughed before she could stop herself. "That's a terrible sales technique." "It's a catastrophe," he agreed. "Preston's going to have my job." And that, though neither of them planned it, was the beginning of the part that mattered, not a negotiation, but two people telling each other the truth in an empty shop that smelled of bread. He told her the offer over the second cup of tea, and it was a large number. Large enough that she made him say it twice, and then set her cup down very carefully, because her hand had gone unsteady the way it had gone unsteady over that first wedding order a lifetime ago. Brentwood wanted to buy Ashby's, not just the shop, the name, the brand, the story, and though Callum said it delicately, the recipe. They'd keep her on, of course, as a figurehead, a word she disliked the moment she heard it. They'd put her bread, her nan's bread, her name, into production, into the lines, into every supermarket from Carlisle to Coventry. Millions of people would eat it. And she and Toby would never have to worry about money again, not for the rest of their lives, not for the rest of his life. A thing she'd stopped believing was possible somewhere around the winter the oven died. She should have said yes on the spot. Any sensible person would have said yes on the spot. And she sat in her own shop in the warmth of her own ovens, holding a cup of tea, and she felt the floor of the lift drop the way it had dropped the night the oven went, except this time it was dropping towards something that looked like solid ground, and she was, to her own bewilderment, afraid of it. "I need to think," she said. "Of course. No, I mean, I need you to understand that when I say I need to think, I'm not haggling. I've watched people haggle. That's not what this is." She turned the cup in her hands. "This shop nearly didn't happen about 9 times. I sold my nan's ring for that oven back there. I stood in a market hall for 6 hours and sold 9 loaves and wanted to die. And the thing that got me through all of it, the only thing, was that it was mine. My name on it. Made by my hands the way she taught me. And you're offering me more money than I've ever imagined to make it not that anymore." Callum was quiet for a long moment. And then he did a thing that was very much against his own interests. A thing that Preston Vale would have fired him for on the spot, and he did it because the bread had done something to him, had reminded him of a boy he'd been before he learned to read faces like spreadsheets. "Can I tell you something I shouldn't?" he said. "Can I tell you something I shouldn't?" he said again, quieter, and Maren nodded, and Callum Reeve told her the truth about what Brentwood did to the things it bought. He'd watched it happen a dozen times. That was the part of the job he'd stopped letting himself think about. A small maker with something real, a cheese, a pie, a bread, would sign the papers for a number that changed their life, and for the first year everything would be as promised. The figurehead in the adverts, the story on the packaging, founded by so-and-so, still made the traditional way. And then, quietly, in the second year or the third, the accountants would come, and the traditional way would become a bottleneck, and a food technologist in a lab in Warrington would be asked to reformulate the product so it could be made on a line at a fraction of the cost, with a shelf life of weeks instead of days. The hand shaping went first, then the long ferment, because time is money and a dough that takes 18 hours costs more than a dough that takes 3. By the end there'd be a loaf on a shelf, with a founder's smiling face on the wrapper, and not one thing inside it that the founder would have recognized as their own. "The name stays," Callum said. "That's what they're actually buying. The name and your face and the story about the ring. The bread," he stopped. "The bread's the one thing they don't need to keep, once they own the right to call it yours." The shop was very quiet. Somewhere in the back the ovens ticked as they cooled. "Why are you telling me this?" Maren said at last. "You'll lose your job." Probably. He looked down at the crust he'd set on the counter, the one he'd eaten like it might break. "I've spent 6 years telling myself it was just business, that people knew what they were signing, and mostly they did." He met her eyes. "But I ate your bread, Mrs. Ashby, and I remembered my grand's kitchen, and I remembered I used to want to be a person who made things instead of a person who takes them apart. And I can't sit here and watch it happen to yours and call it a good day's work. That's all. That's the whole reason." Maren was quiet for a long time. And then, because she'd learned across the years that you meet honesty with honesty or you lose the right to expect it, she said, "Then help me think of another way. Because I'm tired, Mr. Reeve. I'm 44 and my hands hurt every morning, and I'd be lying if I said the number didn't sound like a door opening. I don't want to spend the rest of my life afraid of the ovens dying. I just don't want to sell the one thing that's mine to do it." "No," he said, "I don't think you should either." Toby found out the way 17-year-olds find out things, which is by half hearing them and jumping to the wrong conclusion. He came in the back Friday afternoon, dropped his college bag by the mixer and said, too casually, "So we're selling up then, to the Brentwood lot." He'd seen the wheat sheaf on a letterhead on the kitchen table. He'd done the maths that any bright, anxious kid does when a big company comes sniffing round the thing that's kept the roof over his head, which is the maths of what happens to me, dressed up as not caring. Maren wiped her hands and sat him down and told him all of it, the number and the confession and the food technologist in Warrington, and she watched his face go through the same country hers had gone through the night before, the door opening, the fear, the pull of a life without the fear in it. Because it was his inheritance they were talking about. His name too, in a way. And though she'd never made him feel the weight of it, his hands, he was the only other person alive who knew how to make the bread, and a part of the thing Brentwood was buying, whether they knew it or not, was locked up in a 17-year-old's fingers. "They can have the money," Toby said finally, and he sounded older than he was. "I don't care about the money. I care that Nan taught you and you taught me, and if you sell it to them then in 3 years it's just Warrington bread with your face on the bag. That's worse than not doing it at all. That's like," he groped for it, "that's like they'd have killed it and put its head on the wall." Maren looked at her son, at this boy who'd sat on a stool and watched the ovens his whole life, and she understood that whatever she decided it for two. The confrontation, when it came, was with Preston Vale, and it came because Callum did the second thing that week that could cost him his job. He told Maren exactly how to have it. Vale drove up himself when the deal didn't close on his timeline, a smooth man in a better suit than Callum's, with a smile that arrived a half-second before it reached his eyes. He'd expected a grateful market baker and a signature. He found instead a woman who'd had a week to think, a son who stood at her shoulder with his arms folded, and a set of terms she'd worked out at her own kitchen table with a man she was no longer entirely sure was Brentwood's. She didn't shout. That wasn't her. She let Vale make his pitch, the millions and the supermarkets and the millions of people, and she let him finish, and then she said, in the flat brooking no-argument way she'd learned from Sylvie a decade before, "You can license the name for the range you already make. Ashby's on the sliced bread if you want the story so badly. I'll do the adverts. I'll smile. And the shop stays mine, the freehold, the recipe, all of it. And it makes what it makes by hand the way it's always made, and it is never, ever produced on a line. You don't get the recipe. Not the real one. That's not for sale at any number because it isn't written down, and the only 2 people who know it are standing in this room, and neither of us is signing it away." She slid a single sheet across the table. "That's the deal. You get the name and the face you actually want. I keep the thing you were going to throw away." Vale's smile did something complicated. "That's not the deal I authorized." "No," said Maren. "It's the one you're going to take. Because your marketing people want the woman who sold her Nan's ring, And if I walk out of here, I'll go and tell that story to your competitor instead, and to every newspaper that'll have me, about the big bakery that wanted to take a widow's recipe and make it in a factory. You bought a story, Mr. Vale. Stories can be told about you as easily as for you. It was Callum's line, that last part. He'd given it to her in the empty shop 2 nights before, knowing what it would cost him when Vale worked out where it came from. Vale looked at him now, across the table, and understood everything, and Callum met the look and didn't drop it. The papers took 11 weeks to draft, and Maren read every line of every draft herself. She'd learned that much across the years, that the danger in a thing is never in the number at the top of the page. It's in the clauses near the bottom that a tired person skims. So she sat at the kitchen table on Prospect Row, where she still lived because she'd never seen the sense in moving away from the house that had held her when nothing else would. And she went through the licensing agreement line by line with a solicitor Sylvie's nephew knew. And where a clause tried to be clever, she made them take it out. The deal that finally got signed was the deal she'd slid across the table. Brentwood licensed the Ashby's name for their existing sliced range, a product Maren would never pretend was her bread, but which carried her story and her face and a line she'd insisted on, small print made large. Inspired by the Ashby's Bakery, Prospect High Street, where the original is still made by hand every day. An arrow, in effect. A door held open, pointing away from the factory loaf toward the real one. The marketing people had balked at it and Maren had held firm, because she understood something Vale's people didn't. The story only worked if the real thing still existed at the end of it. Kill the shop and the story died with it, and then the name on the bag was just a name. She took a licensing fee, not a sale. Less money, far less than the millions Vale had first waved at her. Enough that the fear was gone for good, enough for Toby's design course and a proper holiday, the first they'd ever taken, a week in Cornwall where Maren sat on a beach and watched her son learn to surf and cried behind her sunglasses for no reason she could have explained to anyone. But she'd kept the freehold. She'd kept the recipe. She'd kept her hands and Toby's hands as the only 2 places in the world it lived. And every morning she still turned the key in the door under the sign. A signwriter had painted at half rate because his mother swore by the sourdough, and the bread still came out right. Preston Vale took the deal in the end because Callum had read him correctly. He wanted the story more than he wanted the recipe, and a story he could get without a fight was worth more to him than a recipe he'd have to litigate for. He signed with his half-second smile and shook Maren's hand and drove back down the motorway, and she never saw him again, and that suited her. Callum lost his job, more or less on schedule. It wasn't dramatic. Vale didn't need it to be. There was a restructure in the new year, and Callum's role was consolidated, and he was thanked for 6 years of service in a meeting that lasted 9 minutes, and everyone in the room understood exactly why, and no one said it aloud. He rang Maren to tell her before she heard it elsewhere, and she was quiet on the line. And then she said the thing she'd been turning over since the night in the empty shop. "Come and work for me." He laughed, thinking she was being kind. "I'm not being kind," she said, and he could hear that she wasn't. "I'm rubbish at the numbers, Callum, genuinely rubbish. I've grown this thing on stubbornness and good bread, and I've hit the edge of what stubbornness can do. I need someone who reads spreadsheets like faces, and I happen to know one who's just been let go by the biggest bakery in the north for having a conscience at the wrong moment." A pause. "It doesn't pay millions. It doesn't pay much. But you'd be making something again instead of taking it apart. You said that's what you used to want. I'm offering you the chance to find out if you meant it." There was a long silence on the line, the silence of a man who'd forgotten he was allowed to want things. "Yes," said Callum Reeve, "all right. Yes." Whether it became more than that in the years after, whether the 2 tired people who'd told each other the truth across a counter grew into something neither of them had gone looking for, is their own business, and Maren would have thanked you not to ask. But he stayed. He was good at it. Under his hand the one shop became 3, then a small handful, each one with its own ovens and its own bakers, and not a single loaf made anywhere but by hand, because that was the line neither of them would cross no matter how the numbers begged. He never once suggested a factory. It never once occurred to him to. Toby was 24 when the thing happened that Maren thought of, afterward, as the moment she finally understood what she'd protected. He'd finished his course and come back into the business, not because she'd asked. She'd been careful never to ask, but because he'd gone out into the world of design agencies and open-plan offices and found it hollow, and he'd missed the smell of the ovens the way you miss a language you were raised in. He ran the look of the whole thing now, the branding, the little painted loaf that had grown up into something people recognized. But on Saturday mornings he still baked. Hands in the dough, sleeves shoved up, the recipe living in his fingers exactly as it had lived in his grandmother's and his mother's, passed down the only way it had ever gone, hand to hand, never onto paper, never onto a line. A journalist came to do a piece on them that year, one of the weekend supplements, the kind of feature with soft photographs of flour in the light. And she asked Maren near the end the question they always asked. Didn't she regret it? All that money turned down for a market stall's worth of pride. Wasn't there a version of her in some other life, sitting on a beach in the Caribbean, rich as anything, who'd made the sensible choice? Maren thought about the winter the oven died, about the ring on the jeweler's scale, about 9 loaves sold in 6 hours and the floor of the lift dropping away, about a boy doing a lap of the yard with his arms out like an aeroplane. There was a night, she said, years ago when I first started, and my son asked me why I'd put our name on the bread. And I told him because it's ours. Nobody can take a thing that's got your own name on it. She looked out through the shop window to where Toby was setting the morning's loaves in the racks, sleeves pushed up, flour to the elbow. I was wrong, as it turned out. People can take it. There was a man with a very large check who nearly did. What I learned is that keeping a thing isn't about refusing the world. It's about knowing which part of it is actually you, and not letting go of that, whatever they offer for the rest. The journalist waited, pen up. They can have my name on a bag in a supermarket, Maren said. I don't mind. It's a nice story and it's mostly true. But the bread, the real bread, my nan's bread, the thing itself, that was never for sale, and it never will be because it doesn't live in a recipe or a contract or a factory in Warrington. She held up her hands, flour worked into the lines of them, the same hands that had failed at the first loaf and gone back and failed and gone back. It lives here, and in his, and that no one can buy, I know. A man with millions tried, and I looked at what he was offering, and I looked at my son, and I kept the part that mattered. She smiled then, and it reached her eyes the whole way, the way Preston Vales never had. It turns out that was the cheaper thing anyway, she said. It just took me 44 years, and a dead oven to learn how to count. Outside, the morning light came through the window and lay across the racks of cooling bread, and Toby whistled something tuneless the way his grandmother used to, and the shop smelled the way it had always smelled, the way Callum had walked into 10 years before and remembered a boy he used to be. The sign over the door said Ashby's in a hand-painted script, one woman's own handwriting blown up large. It had said it through the lean years and the offer and everything after. It said it still. Nobody had taken it. She'd made sure of that herself, with her own 2 hands, the way she'd made sure of everything, by going back, and going back, and going back, until the thing she'd built was too much herself to be bought away from her. The bread came out right. It always had. On the mornings when nothing else would, that was the thing she held on to, and in the end it had held on to her.